Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to talk to you guys about something that may or may not be applicable to you. It might be useful to a lot of people if they coach people or they want to do comparisons of relative strength. But this is kind of the thing that comes up. I've presented for you guys strength standards and charts and everything showing that yes, there are universal strength standards. There are comparisons, and they're usually in standardized lifts because that's what a coach, that's what a trainer, that's what everyone needs to be able to compare different individuals to assess their relative strength, their relative full body strength, their squat strength, their pressing strength. You need these standardized methods to look at it, to even compare people across weight and everything. That's why these charts and standards exist. It's a valuable training tool. But the question we also run into is, do we need standards for non-standardized lifts, for accessory work? And how do you make those comparisons? And there's a lot of ways to do this. And again, can be very useful for people who are coaching people, because ultimately, why do we do accessory work? We do accessory work to bring up a weak point. We do accessory work because it in some way improves the function of a primary lift. And the same could be said even for people who are doing it for aesthetic purposes. You're trying to bring up a weak point, right? You're trying to bring up a weak point that your bench press or your overhead press or your weighted chin up or whatever basic exercise you program and do all the time, you're trying to correct that imbalance. You are trying to remove your weak points, whether they're a performance weak point, an aesthetic weak point, and an injury prevention weak point. Right, there's a lot of different ways to assess these things. So weak points is kind of a general term. So we get over to accessory work and we start to ask the question of, well, how do we assess relative strength on this stuff? There's not charts. And this also comes up when we try to compare a lot of these silly gym lifts, like I've been discussing lately with all these goofy partials and other stuff. But there are coaches who do have strength standards for those things. And the reason they put these in place is because they use them. Biggest example I can think of would be the West Side Barbell guys and Louis Simmons. And I've heard Louis lecture on a lot of this. And you guys need to understand, this isn't necessarily going to apply to you as raw lifters, because I'm going to be honest with you. You can get really strong on a 2-board press or really strong on your slingshot bench or whatever you happen to be doing, and it doesn't mean you're going to get stronger. In other words, there's no guarantee that that exercise is going to carry over to a raw pause bench, even if you add 50 pounds or 80 pounds to it. You might find that your pause bench doesn't improve at all because you inadequately train certain ranges of motion, and you inadequately train biggest primary mover involved, in this case your pectorals, which you need to get the weight started out of the bottom. So they got neglected. It might not actually improve it. But you know what? Accessories don't always improve everything. When you're dealing with stuff like the West Side guys, they have to have ways to track and compare this because they rotate through max effort exercises, right? They rotate through their max effort exercises. So for their bench press, they might actually do a max on a 3-board press one week, a max on the 2-board press the next, a max on the 1-board press the next, a max running 200 pounds of chain variation and accommodating resistance the next, and maybe a reverse band the next. But you also need to remember they are training for a shirted bench. So everything that they train for essentially is an accommodating resistance exercise. But they do have these 4 comparisons, because here's the thing. Let's say you're coaching 8 guys in one time in a system like that, and you're rotating all 8 of those guys through these basic exercises. And you need to know how they stack up. And I've heard Louis speak specifically of like the glute ham raise, that he says, if I have a guy who squats 850 in his multiply suit, and I'm training him next to a guy who squats 750 in his suit, I can use the accessory work to try to get him caught up. In other words, if the 850 squatter, I rotate them through in the same training system, and he does X amount of weight on a glute ham raise, therefore he has stronger hamstrings than my 750 squatter, I might assume that if there's 100 pounds difference or 50 pounds difference in their glute ham raise work sets, that I need to get the 750 squatter caught up to the same weight. and the same workload the 850 squatter does on his hamstring work, like his weighted glute ham raise. That if I do that, odds are I can bring my 750 squatter up to the 850 squatter. When his accessory work equals it, when we get them over into the suited maxes and everything else, we're probably going to see closer numbers to their strength. Same thing, if I'm rotating through a group of guys, and I've got a guy who in his on his 2-board press, he benches 800, and another guy only benches 700 on his 2-board press, I'm going to assume there's probably about a 100-pound difference in their max bench. And so therefore, I need to bridge the gap and get the 2-board press on the guy who presses 700 pounds up to 800 pounds. Now, a lot of people are going to go, wait, those are crazy numbers. Well, that's what equipped lifters lift, guys. There's a reason you need to be board pressing 700-800 pounds. That's why if you see a person doing accommodating resistance and they're only doing 400 pounds at the lockout, I can promise you they're not going to be very competitive as a power lifter in the equipped world. All right, they need to be benching 700 pounds on the lockout. All right, on their board presses. They need to be doing that, or they're not going to be competitive in that environment, because these guys use shirts, and those shirts sometimes give them a 300 or 400 pound difference in competition versus what they could bench just in a t-shirt. And therefore they need to be that strong on the lockouts. If they can't lock that out on a board, they can't lock it out in the shirt. So yeah, those numbers are crazy, but that's what is built around that sport. And because they do all these partials and all this accommodating resistance, yeah, they can do direct comparisons of that. Now, the only time these comparisons work, though, are people who actually train all the lifts. In other words, if you're using some accessory lift and you rotate someone in who doesn't do that accessory nearly as often, you don't really have a valid comparison. But it is fair to say that if you have two different lifters who you are having do a similar accessory, and they share a similar weak point, then yeah, if you bring their accessories up to match, their primary exercises, their big lifts, are probably going to be a lot closer. But where people will make those mistakes is don't take an oddball exercise and compare two of your lifters or an accessory movement who one of them trains that movement frequently and the other one is new at it, because they shouldn't be equal unless the other guy is dramatically stronger. In other words, you could be a 365 pound bench presser, but if I put you on a closed grip floor press, you're not going to be as strong on the closed grip floor press the first week or two you do it as a guy who benches 20 pounds less than you but uses that accessory fairly frequently. He might be closed grip floor pressing, out pressing you by 50 pounds, even though he's 20 pounds weaker on the bench press, because he practices the exercise. He has the motor patterns down. But yeah, that is a good way to compare your guys if you're running everyone through the same program and you're rotating through those same exercises week to week. That's a valuable tool for doing it. But it is important to remember that can work in a certain environment if those accessories have a direct and measurable carryover to what you're doing. In some cases, they may not be. In a person, that might be their strong point, and another person, that's their weak point. It might be a different comparison. Or if one of them is more practiced at it than another. And that's important with any lift that you do also. You can't use something that's a non-standard exercise and compare people who don't do it. And accordingly, that's what you're going to find. Too much focus on accessory work in general, what many people call majoring in the minors, will sometimes not give you the desired result. You're going to get weaker at the big exercise. But the whole point that comes back to is that you really need standardized versions of comparing your different lifters. And if you choose to use a non-standard lift as a coach or a personal trainer or anyone else, you are shooting yourself in the foot unless you have a very, very good reason to use it, because you're going to need to work with several dozen different clients and athletes regularly so that you can establish a baseline of what's an acceptable progression on that exercise, what's acceptable strength ranges, what do you expect from an intermediate, a novice, and advanced lifter at any different body weight on that exercise, because that is ultimately what you're trying to do, is improve their performance, because improved performance is what makes you stronger, it's what makes you bigger, it's what makes you a better athlete. So ultimately, if you are using anything that's not standardized and doesn't have a chart, you are going to have to actually collect a fair amount of data on that exercise personally to really effectively use it as a coach. So there's a reason most people who don't have 10 or 15 years of coaching experience already should really only stick with basic stuff for the majority of their training. There's good reason for that when you are trying to compare the strength of your different athletes and to carry over the different exercises. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.